All right. I am showing that it's 2 minutes after, so we are going to go ahead and get started. We do have the talk booked for 50 minutes so that everyone can get to their 1 o'clock. So we'll continue to add people as they arrive in the waiting room. But first of all, I just want to make a note that we are recording this session. So just be aware we are recording it. It will be available later on the University Library's YouTube site. So thank you all for coming to the first Architecture Library book talk. And a shout out to César, who kind of got the ball rolling by asking me earlier this semester if we ever did such a thing. And here we are. We're doing it. So thank you to our 4 speakers. The way we are going to run things today is each of them is going to have a few minutes to give an overview of their book. And then we'll all come back together and have conversation about the research process, publication, commonalities, differences. And then we will have some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to be adding them to the chat throughout, but we'll save them for the latter part of the session. So I see everybody is muted, so excellent. And if you're speaking and you want your camera on, great. If you're not speaking, let's turn them off so we save our Wi-Fi, and then we'll all come back together for the conversation and the Q&A portion. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first faculty author is Anna de Brea. And I have their bio information up here on the screen. I'll let you all read it as we're switching in between speakers. So Anna is up first, and her book is Total Latin American Architecture, the Libretto of Modern Reflections and Contemporary Works. And so I'll turn it over to Anna to give her overview.
Okay, I'm not seeing the images. Is that?
Please share the screen.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry guys. Let me share the screen. I'm looking at our beautiful presentation here on mine.
I didn't know. I'm very bad at this, so that's why.
All right, you should all see our talk. Okay, and here is Anna's biographical information. And now I will turn it over to her to give her overview.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you, César, for this idea. I think is really great. So this first slide shows that this is my third book. I had 2 books before. They were just in Spanish language, but I thought of bringing those here because I believe they are connected. And I was for a long while working as part of a team for a newspaper in all over South America. You have here also information in the newspapers about what is going on with architecture or engineering, but there in South America and in some countries in Central America too, there is an insert that appears weekly where you can find news and projects in relationship to different cities. And so, but I wanted to write a book. So my first book was a romantic novel. And I had to put a nickname because I didn't want that to be related to architecture. I'm saying this because I thought it was a silly thing to do, So I was thinking, okay, I cannot be an architect and a writer of romantic novels. But that is what happened to me. That's the story. And my first book is that one, Señores Architecture, Mr. Architects, is a conversation between 2 different architects that were very well known all over the region. And one is kind of Le Corbusier type of architect, and the other one could be a Mies van der Rohe. And so that was my first intention. So I wanted to have a book. I thought of that idea. I said, how, if those people were here with us. I would, like to have a conversation between Corbeau and Miss Van der Rohe. And that was my proposal. I went to, I didn't know a lot about them. I didn't know them personally, but I, I put, I make an appointment and they received me and they did. So in terms of the research, was very interesting that we met for months every Friday just to have that discussion. And to me was, I would say, another master degree because I learned a lot. And in the process, I had to, I recorded every conversation. It was very interesting, the whole process. Then I went to the other book that is 10 by 50. So this one is a collection on different conversations also, that I had individual conversations with 50 different architects. They were all from the territory of Latin America, but they were working at different parts of the world. And this one has a bonus track, I would say, that is César Pelli, because at the time that I came to the US to meet with him and to have the conversation, there was a problem. So when the book was almost in the process of being published, he called me and he said, I am in Buenos Aires for just one day. So do you want to have that conversation that we couldn't have? So I included, so it's 10 by 50 plus one. That would be the title. And then, but if you see, there was always, for me, for the research, there was always this need for me to learn more, So I wanted to hear those people talking, Mies and Le Corbusier, Testa and Roberto Alvarez. And the other ones, I wanted to have conversations about architecture. I never thought of Latin architecture. I always thought of modern architecture. That is my research, my interest in the research. So when I came to, later I went to Europe for a while. I was in Germany teaching, and then I was invited to come here to the US as visiting scholar. And when I was in my studio and I was referring to a lot of people from a lot of projects from South America, Latin America, so I didn't have really enough material to show because of different reasons. But so I started thinking of that possibility of writing a book. At the very beginning was, the need to, you can pass to the other one. So there was, this idea of questioning what Latin American architecture, would be. I do not believe um, in adjectives, in relationship to architecture. I really, it's difficult for me to understand what is good and what is bad because it depends on the framework from where you see things. And so I try to emphasize the idea that architecture is a verb, is a tool we have to say things, right, to construct a better world. And and it's architecture or it's not architecture. Architecture is the qualifier instead of being, instead of qualifying architecture. So the notion of putting this book in English, first my intention was to do it in 2 languages. Then you learn in the process, discussions with the publisher that, I had like 80 different projects or more. I don't remember exactly how many, and different subjects, different people living in different parts of the world. And so this was a lot of material. And so the the publisher didn't want to do it in 2 languages because he was saying that it was, too much. So uh, you can pass it. You can pass it. So the idea was to do it just in one language. That was English. So it's my first book in a different language. That was for me, just that was really interesting to think about. These are, the inserts that appear in the newspaper. So I was, related to the notion of writing, and so this gives you a lot of training. A lot of, it trains your eyes because you capture, mistakes, and you need to know what is important and what is not important. So you can go to the other one. And so, and this is the series of, different actions, in the process. When the students ask me, what is the process to write the book, that the language was, the number of pages was another point that is not even related to the content, all the sequences that, the different workshops and studies, even together with the students, conferences and all that. So I put all these as a film, right, in the book, to show, the entire process. You can go to the other one. So I don't want to, so you can go. And this is also, I need, as many of you know about that. And to me, that is also a process of making, right? The idea of knitting, the idea of, doing every stitch, every point in the fabric was, on one side, was interesting to me as a process of making art, or producing something that I call architecture or functional art. But I think it's interesting, this notion of knitting and weaving, right? So it's a little bit what I think that the books manifest to that, right? To, the notion that it's not just something that you do one day to another. It took me 5 years of research to be able to, and in those 5 years, one was just to review every page and the names and the citations to be clean. And so imagine how many images, also the the authorship of the every picture or every photo that I put there, it needed to be controlled. So this is a piece of architecture that I always tell the students that I am an architect. So this is the most recent piece that I finished a year ago. So that's all. Good.
Thank you, Anna. And Michael, you are up next. And Michael is the author of Resilient Downtowns, a new approach to revitalizing small and medium city downtowns.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for joining in this conversation. So perhaps unlike my colleagues, I did not set out to write a book. I arrived in Oshkosh, a fresh-faced assistant professor, just starting out in my teaching career. And when I arrived in Oshkosh, I noticed that the downtown was struggling. Many of the businesses that were located in the downtown began to move out to the suburban location. In fact, there was an enclosed shopping mall that was also built in the downtown to counteract the effects of the suburban mall. But that too was struggling. Many of the national department stores, such as Sears and JCPenney, when leaving the enclosed shopping mall in the downtown and moving to the highway location. And so for me, I did not understand why that was happening. And so what I did was to ask one of my classes, use one of my classes to do a study to find out why it is that these businesses were deserting the downtown. We not only looked at Oshkosh, we also looked at the surrounding communities, such as Fond du Lac and Green Bay and Appleton, to find out if they were facing the same problems that downtown Oshkosh was facing. When we finished the study, we did a presentation to the community. And as you can see, it attracted the attention of the local newspaper, which published a story of our study. This also drew the attention of civic leaders and the local government. So that was the start of my interest in downtowns. Following that story, I then continued to do research on downtowns. But this time I was also interested in seeing whether the problems that are being encountered in central Wisconsin were also the similar problems that were encountered by other cities around the country. So I brought together several people who were also doing research on downtowns so that they can share their experiences from their own communities about what is happening in their downtowns and what communities are doing, the civic leaders in these communities are doing to try and stem the tide of depopulation of businesses from the downtown. So this book was published in 2001. And so in the next slide, you will see that I moved on to do further research. This time I looked at healthy downtowns across the US and selected 16 healthy downtowns that could serve as exemplary cases of how downtowns can remain healthy even in the midst of the recession at the time I was doing the research. So I visited these 16 cities and spent time in the downtowns, getting firsthand information about what was going on in the downtowns, and also talked to the community leaders and in particular the downtown managers. This helped me to document what these successful downtowns are doing to keep the downtowns healthy. And so this led, the results led to the publication of Resilient Downtowns, which essentially is a manual of how communities can keep their downtowns healthy. Here are examples of communities with healthy downtowns. And this is what they are doing to keep their downtowns healthy. So perhaps when you emulate their strategies, you can also have a healthy downtown. So after publishing this book, I also got into a conversation with the American Planning Association, which funded a research on downtown revitalization that led to the publication of the Planning Advisory Service report, which is written by experts to guide practitioners in the field. So in the next slide, you see the cities that I visited. So you see that I stratified the US into 5 regions and then selected cities from each of these regions. The selection of the cities was based on the literature review. So it's important to do literature review, which helped me to identify the communities that have been touted in the literature as having healthy downtowns. And that is the basis for the selection of these communities. And in the next slide, you'll see that I was not the first to write about downtowns. In fact, the National Main Street Program existed since 1980, advocating for approaches to downtown revitalization. So my research contributed and added on to the existing knowledge on downtown revitalization, because the National Main Street Programs, the focus was primarily on Main Street. My research added on to the existing body of knowledge on downtown revitalization broadly, not just on Main Street. And so my addition and contribution to this literature is in the next slide, which, as you see, is an addition to the existing body of knowledge on downtown revitalization. So in addition to the 4 programs and strategies advocated by the National Main Street Program, I also identified other strategies that were being used by communities to revitalize their downtowns. And these included, as you can see here, getting people to come back to the downtown during the day, but also choose to live in the downtown, using historic preservation to promote heritage tourism and bring people to the downtown. And most importantly, keeping and retaining civic and cultural uses in the downtown. We have an experience here, of course, of moving the jail from downtown to south of Muncie, which is contrary to what we should be doing to keep the downtown healthy. creating a quality of place in the downtown is also important to bring people, particularly the creative class, empty nesters, to the downtown, hopefully, not just to visit, but also to live. So that is the contribution of my book to the literature on downtown revitalization.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to have you come and talk to classes now about literature review when I have to tell them about researching and why you want to do that. So our next faculty author is César Cruz, and he is the author of Puerto Rico's Henry Klum, A Modern Architect's Sense of Place.
Thank you, Amy. If you could go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So my book is a work of architectural history. It focuses on the German Puerto Rican architect Henry Klum. You see him pictured there with his wife and his two sons, or their two sons, Peter and Richard. This is around 1947 when they've been in Puerto Rico for about 3 years. So Henry Klum is not a very well-known architect, to be sure, outside of certain circles. But he did lead a really remarkable life in architecture. So I kind of broke his life down into 3 key periods. One is the German period, the American period, and then finally the Puerto Rican period, which you see is actually the longest out of all of them. So Henry Klum came of age in the golden age of modern architecture, the era of Le Corbusier, the Bauhaus, Mies van der Rohe. He was a young man in his 20s, in the 1920s. And at the same time, though, he was quite critical of a lot of his peers and the master European architects, modern architects of the time. He instead gravitated towards the famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And so eventually he left Germany specifically to try to work with Frank Lloyd Wright. And that's what happened in 1927. He was in the US for a short period of time before he was able to get a hold of Wright and start working for him. And so he worked with Wright from late 1927 to September of 1933. The American period begins with Wright, and he's with Wright in Arizona and in Wisconsin, in really important parts of Wright's development as an architect. Of course, at this point, he's a very well-known architect internationally, even, Wright is. But then after he leaves Wright, and after he kind of takes the lessons that Wright imparted upon him, from about 1933 to 1944, he did definitely gravitate to a lot of different places in the United States. It was the Great Depression. Later in this period, we're talking about the American home front of World War II. So it was not the easiest time to finding work. But he was able to manage a number of exhibits, residential projects, and master planning, eventually landing in Los Angeles in 1943. At that time, a friend of his reached out to him and said, hey, there's work in Puerto Rico that you might be interested in. So he's invited to do public works in Puerto Rico starting in February of 1944. Next slide, Amy, please. So he moves to Puerto Rico in 1944, and he ends up spending the rest of his life, 40 years, in Puerto Rico, so what we have here is a German immigrant, a Frank Lloyd Wright protege, and eventually the person who would become really Puerto Rico's most accomplished modern architect. Well, my book is a biography, to be sure, but it's an unusual biography. So what I do is I focus on this one idea, Henry Klum's sense of place, how it originated, how it developed throughout his many life experiences, and how eventually it manifested itself in his architecture, particularly his residential architecture. So it's important to note, what do I mean by a sense of place? And I certainly had to define this. This book is my doctoral dissertation turned into a book. So at the time that I was working on the dissertation, I had to define a sense of place. And to me, it's a quality that we all possess. It's the beliefs that people adopt, the actions we undertake, the feelings that we develop towards those locations that through time, experience, group norms and practices, personal investment, or immediate appreciation have become important or meaningful to them. So what I did is, again, I traced this idea throughout Klum's life and eventually relating it to his architecture. Next slide, please. So he had many influences that shaped his sense of place. Certainly it began with when he was leaving Germany, in fact, and the decisions that led to that. and also, of course, the time that he spent working with Wright. I outline a small group of those influences and those key life experiences that shaped the sense of place. Probably the first and most important is what I call vernacular influences. So the idea that architecture of a people, of a land, etc., become important to a building tradition. He first kind of really started getting experience in this with a series of Native American projects for the Department of Interior from 1938 to 1941, working in San Francisco, Arizona, a number of other places. And then he did the very same thing, learning about a particular people, their culture, their building traditions, particularly in Puerto Rico from 1944 to 48. Next slide, please. So the vernacular influences was probably one of the most surprising and largest piece of the book and the dissertation. Three other pieces that bear mentioning, though, are the grid in the landscape, open air rooms, and dense urban spaces, and the modern stilt house. The grid in the landscape is deriving order out of context as opposed to a rigid square rectangular grid as a modernist might do, but really more developing an order from what's happening around the site. One example in the lower right-hand corner and the lower center is the Evans house, which is not sitting parallel to the street like all the other houses, but in fact, it makes these turns to turn towards specific views, to be parallel to the topography of the landscape, which actually slopes down to the lower right-hand corner, that sort of thing. Open air rooms, his penchant for designing terraces, patios, gardens, that sort of thing, again, relating to the outside and living life outside as much as possible. And finally, dense urban spaces and the modern stilt house, taking ideas from the way that the rural field workers of Puerto Rico might have built their houses in rough terrain and mountainous terrain, and also balancing nature with the burgeoning modern city, which is the city becoming more and more dense, less and less natural spaces. How do you bring in those open air rooms, even interesting grids, and natural elements such as, again, terraces, gardens, etc. With that, I think I conclude, and then I look forward to your questions at the end.
Thank you, César. Finally, we have Matthew Wilson, and he is the author of Moralizing Space, The Utopian Urbanism of the British Positivists, 1855 to 1920. So Matthew, take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Moralizing Space, if you can turn to the first slide. Moralizing Space is a book about the lives of 6 intellectuals who were affiliated to a philosophy called positivism. It is an intellectual history about the origins of sociology and its connection to modern design theory and practice. So sociology is a relatively new discipline, and a lot has changed about it since it was born in mind. And this book begins with the story of the life of the man who introduced the science of sociology. His name is Auguste Comte. This French thinker was once considered the most brilliant philosopher of the 19th century. And as a sociologist, Comte traced the rise and fall of ancient civilizations and their empires. And he believed it was a scientific law that all empires fall. And for Comte, America's declaration of independence from Britain signaled the imminent collapse of the British Empire. And as a sociologist, he also traced the rapid transformation of society during his own life. And owing to the French and industrial revolutions, Comte believed that science and industry were becoming more influential, more wealthy, more powerful, and broader reaching than any government, aristocracy, and even the Christian church, which he thought was in rapid decline. So nonetheless, Comte thought that religion was important to social order and community and just good behavior generally. And for these reasons, he coined the word altruism as the opposite of egoism. And he most controversially introduced a godless religion based on his scientific laws. He called that religion the religion of humanity. And he believed that the purpose of the premier science of sociology and the religion of humanity was to realize a utopia, 500 city-states across the globe. Next slide. So Comte called this utopia the Occidental Republic, and it would take the place of global empires. And Colt considered it a comprehensive solution to the crises of poverty, individualism, aggressive nationalism and imperialism that plagued his era. He thought that sociologists were the new makers of society, and he imagined that they could plan and design cohesive city-states across the globe. Their towns and countryside, their architecture, their education schemes, festivals, calendar system, governments, finances, flags, coins, their culture generally. And Colt believed that life in his small republics would enable more people to live life to their fullest potential. So he thought that heroic captains of industry, basically people who owed their wealth and fame to scientific inventions, that they would help sociologists to transform the world into his vision. Next slide. So the sociologists that I write about in this book created a series of urban interventions. They established positivist schools, chapels of humanity, debate clubs, field studies groups, art societies, survey clubs, women's groups. And at the same time, they protested against imperialism and the exploitation and poor housing conditions. They denounced slavery, they condemned animal abuse, and they wrote a bevy of books and pamphlets pointing to Comte's vision as the scientific salvation of humanity. Next slide. So Comte's system of positivist thinking had the greatest impact in Britain, owing to a little known figure named Richard Congreve. And he was an Oxford professor with a social conscience, and he quit academia and the Anglican Church with an aim to implement what he called a systematic policy to realize Comte's vision. So Congreve and his most famous pupil, Frederick Harrison, developed sociological surveys of industrial, historical, and geographical phenomena. And among other positivists, they created a social program for these kind of urban interventions that we just saw. And the point was to spread Comte's utopia-making ideas. And based on their gospel of industry, you could call it, Charles Booth, a wealthy industrialist, he thereafter used sociological surveys to create a poverty map across London. And he proposed what he called embryonic urbanisms, or home colonies, to feed and to house and to train the homeless and unemployed. He proposed an old age pension scheme, and he advocated to unite laborers into a grand trade union. And altogether, he called this scheme limited social. Thereafter, Patrick Geddes and Victor Branford used sociological surveys to make recommendations on how to transform abandoned rural areas and downtrodden industrial centers into garden suburbs and garden cities using a practice that they called city design. And that was distinct from the emerging discipline of town planning, which came about around 1903, 1904. And their ideas were based on the work of Congreve and Comte and Ebenezer Howard and Sabella Gurney. So next slide. Moralizing space essentially closes by showing the various ways in which architects and planners used positivist language and planning and design practices to advance the radical humanist claims of the modern movements. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you to all our speakers. That was great. I know it's hard to summarize an entire work like this into just a few minutes, but this gives us a good starting point then to have a conversation. So I did have a few questions that we had talked about discussing, but if anyone wants to put additional questions in the Q&A, we will get to them in a few minutes. But the first question was just this idea that when I talk to students about research, I often describe to them how it is a process and you're never entirely sure where it's going. I mean, if you knew at the outset, like there's no point to go through the research. And I encourage them to really hold themselves open to what comes of their research, you know, what directions it takes you, maybe what tangents you go off on, you know, the information that you didn't know was going to be so essential from the outset. So my first question to you is, do you agree with that idea? And if you do you have any examples from your experience that you can use to help illustrate it? So whoever wants to go first, you can just go for it. Michael,
Well,
I see
I
your hand
think that
raised.
when you conceive of research, a research topic or subject, um, it, it evolves over time. And so it's important to conceive of the idea and how you want to go about accomplishing the idea. And that is all well and good. However, once you start to write and to do further research, you may find that you have to modify your concept and modify your goal for the research, whether it's a book project or whether it is a grant or whatever it is you're working on. So in my example, when I conceived of the book for Resilient Downtowns, what I wanted to do was to talk about and provide a narrative for the healthy downtowns and also compare them to other cities that are not doing too well with their downtowns, you see. But as I began to do the research and to talk to people, it became evident to me that I should stay positive and that if you don't have any nice things to say about people, you don't say them. The same thing applies to cities and to organizations. And so I did not pursue the other half of what I wanted to do, which is to give an alternative view of what not to do and give examples of cities that did not follow the playbook and where they ended with their downtowns. So that was the change that I had to make.
Thanks. That's a great example. I think too of the idea that you don't know until you get into the research. Like you just don't know until you're in it. I see, Cesar, you had your hand raised. Do you have another example?
Yeah, I mean, a great deal of what I wrote about came out of the evidence itself. So I went down to some archives in Puerto Rico and 3 times to look at drawings, read letters, and other documents, etc. And I was looking for evidence of Henry Klum's sense of place. You know, how could I kind of like describe it? How can I trace it through his life and so on? But out of the evidence, then came questions, and I'm like, I don't know the answers to these questions. And so further looking into the evidence came that organization of vernacular influences, of the grid in the landscape, dense urban spaces, and open air rooms. All of that came from the evidence. I had no idea that's how his sense of place would take shape through his architecture. And in fact, that idea of the vernacular influences, him studying and working with Native American populations, artists, construction workers, what have you, and later, same thing in Puerto Rico, completely unexpected. And it came up out of the evidence where some of the things that Klum had done as far as his architecture is concerned, I didn't fully understand until I realized it came out of those vernacular influences. And it was all rooted in the evidence, that evidence to support your argument, but evidence to ask further questions and seek further answers.
Yes, that's a great example. It's a great example too of how it snowballs, that you start, you know, with one piece of it and then it gets bigger and bigger. So Anna or Matthew, do you have examples that you wanted to add to this?
I can say that to me was really a big experience just to think about what publisher I wanted for my book too, right? So today is, it's not it was never an easy task, right? At least for me. But, I wanted to, this was in particular a book that was going to be written in English about, Latin America or questioning what is architecture in Latin America or what is Latin American architecture today, right? In a world that we see how we communicate, we could be in a different place, right? And and I wanted also, it was going to be in English, and I wanted people from Latin America to be involved. So it needed to be very graphic, right? Very communicated in a very particular way. and with a lot of photographs that implies a lot of money. So you, in fact, I changed my publisher, so incredible, that happened also, right? So even with the contract already signed, because, it's not the same if you publish a book um, when you, it's not an isolated, task. So when you publish a book that is, with a publisher that do textbooks, right? And they do any type of books, right? On medicine or different types. Or if you go to a publisher that is really publishes and distributes books in all over the world, right? And they do it, with efficiency. And so I think that to me, just to give you an idea, I went to a meeting in New York with the publishers, and there was this big table and everybody, and I would imagine I'm obsessed, how much I prepare myself for that. I took with me like 15 different possible titles. The book was already put it together almost, and they stopped me in the second, title, and they said, Anna, you want the word architecture to be in the title. You want the word Latin America to be in the title. You want the word contemporary, modern, right? You want people to Google, right, those words, and your book appeared in. So it's not, when I was young, right, younger, I used to understand, research as a very isolated person inside of a library. Now, knowing that everything is digital and you need to invest. My book 5 years ago was almost $60,000 invested to be published. And so you want maybe that you don't have those possibilities, right, every year. So, or you don't have more than one maybe in your life. So I wanted to also to engage with the design of the book, right? A book that was visual. Research for me wasn't only to ask a question.
Well, that's a great thing to think about as well, like how approaching it as a book, and like, did that drive some of the decisions? But Matthew, I wanted to give you a chance. Do you want to say anything about your research? Did it go exactly the way you expected, or did it take you anywhere you weren't expecting?
Well, my book was it was sort of difficult to tie together some of the individuals that I wrote about because they hadn't really been put together in a group. They hadn't been called sociologists, most of them. So I started with kind of an interest in Patrick Geddes, and he was mostly called as sort of the father of at the time whenever I was looking at his research. And there had a book that had come out called The Landscape Urbanism Reader. And that's what I did my master's in landscape urbanism. And in that book, Charles Waldheim writes about how Geddes and McHarg and Lewis Mumford were all sort of formative figures in the emergence of landscape urbanism and town planning, and as sort of distinct things. And so I just began wondering, well, where does all this come from? And so I started reading Geddes's work, and he has a whole series of very enigmatic diagrams, quite peculiar. And I noticed that there was kind of a pattern of references to Comte and Laplace, Frederick Laplace. And so I just sort of, as thinking of as an intellectual historian, what you do is you study, thinkers, and you connect together their ideas. So I went back and started looking at Comte's work, and then how did it sort of translate into Britain, and where did Geddes learn about it, for instance. So I was also reading at the time a really brilliant book by J.G.A. Pocock named The Machiavellian Moment. And it traces how the language of republicanism from the 16th century in Florence percolates across over into America into the 18th century during the American Revolution. So that was the sort of a framework that I was working with. It was just sort of like really delving into, textual analysis, looking at the language, the phrases that people are using, and then doing a lot of archival work. Actually, I found some really great personal confessions of Charles Booth that helped me to sort of recast him as a positivist. He wrote a positivist prayer that I found in the Senate House Library archive. And so that was probably the toughest chapter to write, because usually people say, Booth didn't have an agenda and he was just a straightforward, objective person. So there was a lot of sort of going back and looking at people's lives and their letters and correspondence and things like that.
Yeah, and that's another great example of like finding those touch points through the work. Like, so thank you for all illustrating, my theory that you have to take let the research take you where it's going to take you. Well, a somewhat related question, and then I see we have a couple questions in the chat, so we'll turn to those next. But it builds on what Anna and Michael had said too about in thinking of pulling together the final, book. Like editing is just as important as all of the research and the writing and everything that you compiled for them. So what did you leave out? So when it came to the editing, what did you leave out? And I hear it sounds like Michael, like in the early stages, was leaving out, a whole section that he had thought would be a big part of it. And as Anna was saying, like just even thinking about the format and the illustrations and like the overall sort of visuals of the book. But are there any examples of, things that maybe you even spent a lot of time on, but in order to like really make it a finished book that you edited out?
Well, in my case, and I suspect in my colleague's case as well, the publisher usually appoints or hires an editor for you. And so you as an author works with the editor to finalize the book. And so in many cases, they have questions. They probably are not experts in the subject of the book, but they are good at telling you what doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense to them as a lay person, it's not going to make sense to other people as well. And so in working with the editor, you get questions from them that helps you to reevaluate some pieces that are in the book and decide whether it is worth keeping or eliminating from the final manuscript. So I think that is where the reevaluation of the entire piece comes in after you are, or during the process of editing the book and questions that you may receive from them.
Other examples?
I think that in terms of, what you left, I think that I go to the opposite. I try to be involved in everything, even the format of the book and everything. I know that takes a while, it's not an easy task. I know that. But when you do everything and you are in almost, or you are, part of, the cover, or you give them, on one side, they can negotiate some things, with you because they know there is a part that you do not know. But I think that giving them, so I remember, sending my brochure was almost a book entirely with the cover, with the, I wanted the cover. I wanted to see the book. My book talks that is not front and back anymore, that this notion of 360 degrees. So the book couldn't have it back, and so I was even that detailed. So, but I think that in that scenario they were, they changed some things, we discussed about some things, but was almost the entire package. So that's why I think that we need to think about financial, how that works. Many times you apply to millions of grants and they it's not, so you need to find a way how what is the different process I can do to get that support, right? and for the book, you don't want to give up, projects that were, important for that. But I think that if you are, as I say this to my students, right? If you have, if you have the whole scenario, right? An idea at least of the whole, what you want. So I give them, images of the books that I liked, so even that, right? So what was the type? I didn't want a book to be um, on a table, on a coffee table, right? Or being proud of myself of writing a book. So it was, to me was a different thing. I wanted to continue using it, and I do.
Well, and I think these two examples are getting at the idea too of it being a book, and being edited and the overall everything that goes into it being a book, including the back.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I see we're just at time. Again, this will be recorded. We'll post it in the YouTube channel. Matthew and César, if you have a couple minutes, there is a couple of questions for you in the chat if you have time to address them. But if anyone has to sign off, completely understandable. We all have packed days, but we will take just a couple extra minutes. Do you both have time?
I can just quickly
Okay.
say that McHarg writes in Design with Nature that one of his big influences is Patrick Geddes. So just as a brief response to that question. It's a very good one, by the way. It's something I should look further into.
And the question posed to me was about, did Henry Klum collaborate with any local San Francisco architects, particularly landscape architects, while he was out there? So the answer is no. He was only there for about, on and off, for about 2 or 3 years, working on this specific exhibit on Native American culture and so on. His major collaborations or influences came with Wright, with the 5 years that he spent with Wright. In the late 1930s, Klum did collaborate with Louis Kahn on a series of cooperative housing projects. Before anyone had ever heard of Louis Kahn, before Louis Kahn became the great American architect that he would become later. And there were other encounters with people like Philip Johnson and others throughout his career. But the biggest influence probably Wright for sure, and then Louis Kahn, that probably has yet to be explored as fully as it should be.
Well, maybe another book is in the works, right?
If we can travel, yes.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers. This has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your experiences with all of us. So thank you. And again, we'll make the recording available, and maybe we'll revisit some of these ideas in the fall. I think there's certainly more to cover. So
Thank you.
Thanks a
all right.
lot.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.